All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Adam Bozeman. For those of you that I don't know that are on the webinar, it's funny, you can't really see who the participants are. So I would love to say I'm seeing some friendly faces, but instead, since Gary's thrown up the first slide, what I'm seeing is 35-year-old Adam instead of 47-year-old Adam. So I remember that guy sometime. It looks like I'm probably seeing about 45-year-old Gary Applegate.
That's about right.
Over there. But the other two Garys, you guys have done a great job of keeping current and refreshed pictures. So excellent job there. And Gary, that is a reminder that yes, I still do need to get my profile picture updated. Maybe take just a little snap of this kick off, and then we could be in good shape, because that's pretty, every time I see that, that's pretty embarrassing. Anyway, thanks again for joining. Today's topic really is around, how do you really rethink your go-to-market strategy, in light of the fact that, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, but what's really happened, I think, just from, our business and then what we're seeing within our client base is just a, kind of a pivot and a leapfrog in terms of how people are having to rethink how they sell things and how they make things and how they really interact with their customers. So I'm pretty excited about this. If you think about kind of the usual BGW webinar series that we've been having, it's really been all about the stimulus, the Paycheck Protection Program, and how to really weather different cash flow swings. But part of the things that we've been talking about is, as we start rolling into the new year, and as we don't know whether or not another round of stimulus is coming or not post-election, now really is the time that if you haven't already done it, it's really time to start thinking about, well, what am I going to do next if there's an element of this that represents my new normal in terms of the way that we work? In other words, is it even possible to go back to what it was back in February, even if my sales are the same or even if my sales are up? Has there been a permanent change in how we work and how we interact with customers? Just using BGW as an example, we were all pretty set up for how we were going to work anyway. Shout out to our IT provider, Apex, and that we'd already made the investment to have the ability to work remotely. But our work remotely policy was really driven by, you putting in an application and management approving the application to work from home. Other than that, it was just more, ad hoc as you needed it. And nobody really ever worked from home more than, 1 or 2 days a month. On the client side, I can honestly say that with the exception of one time that I missed a flight due to weather to fly to San Francisco to facilitate an EOS session, I never met with the client virtually. I mean, every other meeting that I'd ever had always was, live. And if it was over the phone, I'd always felt like something was completely missing. So it is just interesting how things have changed for us in the sense that, we're still all working from home at BGW. We are considered essential. Nobody's really got the banner in the yard saying, thank you to all the CPAs that are out there for being essential and getting my taxes done. I say that flippantly. I really do appreciate everything that our frontline workers have done. But, CPAs accounting services are considered essential services. So with that in mind, we could be in the office, but we're not, because we still have a lot of people that have kids at home that are doing things that would necessitate making it pretty tough for them to be back in the office in more of a full-time capacity. So we've still provided people with a lot of flexibility on that front. On the client side, we've started interviewing our clients and asking them, do you want to meet live? Are you okay with the virtual meetings? And I think what we found is that, generally we can still be pretty productive, even if it's over a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, but people still want to see you live, kind of at least once a year is what we're finding at BGW. And, I think the other thing that really hit for me is that, um, if I look at our strategic plan, sure, on it was the ability to really work for anywhere. And a lot of that's driven by my own selfish desire to eventually work off a boat in the Caribbean. So, we're driving for that, guys. But independent of that, you know, so we're there. But at the same time, we never set out to create a virtual CPA firm. There are people that created virtual CPA firms. That was not us. We always have figured that we're going to have a bricks and mortar presence, because of the ability to do, seminars, client meet and greets, have a big centralized place where we can train people. We're having to rethink through all those things where I don't think we'll end up being virtual, but in terms of how we go back to work, it is going to look somewhat different going forward. And if I look at our client base, it really has gone across the spectrum, from people that have pivoted and started doing more PPE type sales things that might not have been in PPE before, to other things that I think people have been struggling with. Some of our manufacturers, they have this massive backlog, but at the same time, they're not as productive and they can't really pinpoint why, other than they've had some absenteeism and people just aren't, they just aren't, the effort level and the sense of urgency isn't there like it used to be before. So I really have seen a gamut of changes, and at the same time, I think BGW itself and myself have been indicative of our client base, where it's almost like we've been in this fog of, hey, we're forced into something. Okay, we survived it. When are we coming out of the fog? And the answer is we're not. It likely has permanently changed somehow. So the question is, how can we really embrace this? So knowing that this was one of the things that our clients really needed to start thinking about, I really am appreciative of the G3 band here for pulling this seminar together, because really the purpose here is to really get everybody thinking about, all right, what, if this was kind of this, fat tail game changing type moment, what really can we be doing differently to embrace that and really make a leapfrog ahead of our competition and other market forces that'll be a game changer. So with that in mind, I'm going to shut up now and let our panelists introduce themselves. Gary, I would ask that you go ahead and mute me because bathroom renovations, we were joking as we got on the panel about something's always going on. Apparently it was a good idea to do bathroom renovations while doing a webinar right now. So anyway, Gary, if you could introduce yourself, Gary Applegate, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great. That'd be great. And then hand it off to Mr. Gary Frey and then Gary Schwake. That would be great if you guys could introduce yourselves to our panelists. And then Gary is going to be our moderator. He'll have our rules, but generally, we'll get through a slide, ask your questions as you've got them. As with the usual BGW webinars, what we'd ask is, if you have a question, use the Q&A feature of Zoom's, because we'll be able to publish those questions and answers. If it's just general hazing to make fun of how I look or how Gary looks, then go ahead and save that for the chat. That's where we usually do the hazing. So with that in mind, Mr. Applegate, we've known each other forever. So I am intimately familiar with what you do, but if you could introduce yourself to our panelists, that'd be great.
Sure, I appreciate that. Good morning. Adam and I have known each other for years now, and kind of goes back to your early beginnings here in Charlotte, and which were also my early beginnings here in Charlotte. And so what I do is I own a company called Centerpoint CFO, and we do fractional CFO work for businesses that are essentially in the same market that BGW is in, but kind of the low end of the middle market. And we do fractional CFO, we do interim CFO, and we also do financial project work as well. And we have a stable of controllers that can operate in the same type of capacity. So we tend to look at things very analytically, very much from a return on investment point of view, and that's probably going to be my participation in today's session as well. So With that, I will throw it over to Mr. Frey, or G2 as we call him.
Hey, everybody. So yeah, what's funny is I first met Gary Applegate with a mutual client that I was coaching, and he was the interim or fractional CFO. And he was the first Gary, so he was G1 and I became G2. And then we were, the trilogy wasn't complete until we met Gary Schwake about a year ago. And then Gary Schwake said, hey, I would really like to do this. And what's funny is everybody on this panel, from Adam and the rest of the G3 band, all of us have started, run, or turned around companies. And some of us have done all three of those things. But so anyway, I became G2 and Gary Schwake became G3. But this is really Gary Schwake's expertise area. He's the one that had this idea to bring it to you and everybody that's listening to this thing, because we all care about business owners and businesses in particular, because as the businesses go, so do the families go, and so does our community, which we're all very committed to all three of those things. And so we all have different perspectives on this. So I think it's going to be a fun panel. So Gary Schwake, you're really the ringmaster. So you go ahead and take it, and I'll mute myself.
That is a scary thought if I'm the ringmaster of the G3 band, but I will humbly accept the responsibility. Good morning, everybody. Gary Schwake. I'm a partner at Yield Group. And as Gary mentioned, really actually more of an entrepreneur, founded, started, scaled, exited businesses, and brought that experience together with some other senior folks to form a growth advisory firm called Yield Group, which is really around this concept of go-to-market. And as Gary Frey mentioned, we've seen many times where as you're running a business, you may be 20 years into it, and things just all of a sudden feel more difficult than they used to be. And obviously, when you have seismic shifts like we've experienced here recently, all the more reason to kind of take a fresh look. And so Gary and I have been chatting over the course of the last year or so, share a mutual love of small to medium-sized businesses and their founders and executive teams and all the people that are day-to-day creating value for their companies, their communities, and their families. And so we thought, let's have a little chat about this, because I think can help provide at least some structure to how to think about this, some frameworks that really will help you think about how to approach this in these crazy times. So really excited to be here. It's going to be a good discussion, I think. Good perspectives all around the horn.
All right. So before we jump into this thing, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and then Gary Schwake, G3, you let me know when you want me to throw up the screen again, and then we'll advance the slides. Hopefully we'll do that without a lot of fumbling and bumbling. But no guarantees. So let's start with understanding and just getting on the same page on go-to-market strategies, because having been in marketing positions a long time ago in my early career, go-to-market strategies typically meant, hey, we've got a new product or new service we're going to launch. Let's go into that. And I would like to get your perspective on that, Gary Schwake, and kind of set the table for everybody on what does that mean, especially now, because it's clearly more than just a new product going to market.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, we find that a lot, right? Everybody thinks they know go-to-market strategy is typically around, we're launching a new product, we're starting a new company. And it's that whole process of looking at the integrated collection of strategy, data, tech, processes, and people on which a company uses to take whatever that thing is to market. Now, the reason that we label ourselves as really go-to-market consultants or advisory firm, growth consulting, is that the reality now more than ever, because of the velocity of the change of the buyer due to digital and behaviors and patterns, is that you've never gone to market. Even if you've been in business for 20 plus years, you're always going to market. And you should constantly be reassessing the rhythm and that collection of inputs that are necessary to do that successfully. Because in my 25 plus year experience in a variety of businesses and sizes and what have you, the place that I have always seen it work well is when all of the pieces and functions are integrated and they're applied against a common strategic vision of thorough understanding of the buyer. What we'll be talking about isn't rocket science. It's like it's intuitive, but then it's the application of that that makes it difficult. So it's, we would advocate that it's not just about sales. It's not just about marketing. It's about how all those components fit together. And then an important variable that's more and more different today than it's been even 5 years ago is the importance of data and technology in order to execute that well. Whether you're a restaurant or a services business or a technology business, a manufacturer, distributor, whatever the case may be, you've heard the adage software is eating the world, and it's because we're literally digitizing all of those touch points. And so that's become a really important element of go-to-market strategy as well.
As the financial guy, I hear go to market, and I think of a range of possibilities, and often those range of possibilities have a lot to do with the maturity of the business. If it's a startup, there tends to be a lot more excitement and early initiative and spend pre-revenue. But if it's a more mature company, and certainly if it's a more mature company that's re-entering a market or entering a new market already on a base platform, it's a little less risky, but and there's a little less cost up front. So, as I hear go to market, I start to think about costs associated with going to market before I allow myself to get excited about the results of going to market. So, as we talk through this, and as you start getting into your pillars, I'm probably going to be maybe teasing you with some questions regarding what type, how long does this take, and what type of costs are looking at, who's in the room, and that sort of thing. Right. Because in my mind, like I said earlier, very analytical. In my mind, I'm putting together the financial model, right? What's the ROI on this thing going to be eventually, and what are the costs that we need to start tracking now, and when does that return start to happen, and then what does that return wind up being? So, yeah, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. Okay, so why don't we, with that, Gary Applegate mentioned the 4 pillars. So Gary Frey, if you wouldn't mind putting up that next slide so we can at least we can start with that.
If we can, there we go.
Okay, so this is Yield's perspective of 4 pillars of go-to-market. You've seen there's a wealth of information out there, but we have found, again, a lot of the literature that you'll find on go-to-market tends to be around new company formation and product launches. And so for us, this is a core theme of any go-to-market at any point in time. And as Gary Frey pointed out, and even Adam referenced earlier, I would argue that effectively any company anywhere, particularly in the lower middle market, is in a period of reassessing go-to-market. It is fundamentally changed, and it's time to take a look at that. So the important thing, though, is how do you do that? There's a lot to cover. So we look at 4 pillars. First is strategy and market segmentation validation. So we'll go into some more detail on that. But I consider this is really how we would describe the North Star, right? You can do 2, 3, and 4, but if your number 1 isn't clearly defined, you're doing a lot of work and going in the wrong direction, or you've got bunch of people on one side of the boat rowing in one direction and other people rowing in the other. So this is a step that is often assumed that people understand. There's a lot of tribal knowledge and intuition, and it's extremely healthy to codify that and actually put it down, and then actually build a rhythm around making sure that you're using data to make sure that it's still valid, excuse me, year over year. The second is validation of the buyer and journey. And this is a similar approach, which is really understanding the customer. And what's interesting, and Gary Frey and I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago, is a lot of companies, especially those that have been successful for quite a while, think they know their buyer, but then when you really tear apart, when the CFO comes in and starts to tear apart the actual customer makeup and who's delivering value and creating value, where your resources are being spent, you'll find that your buyer actually might have shifted over the years. Like who's buying your product today may be very different than who you think is buying your product, or who's buying your product ends up being a different company 2 or 3 years after being a customer with you. And those are very subtle shifts that you don't see over time. And so it's really important to constantly reassess that. The other thing that the velocity of this has changed considerably is, over which you have no control, the number of inputs and technological changes in the way people consume information day to day is changing all the time. Just pick up your mobile phone today. Think about even just 5-6 years ago. It's hard to believe that just 13 years ago, the iPhone came out. I mean, it's such a pervasive part of what we do. I have to remind my children that you used to not be able to pick up a phone and say, I'm not even going to say, hey, Google, because my phone will pick up, or hey, Siri, for all of you who now have your Siri talking to you. But that change, that velocity of change is increasing, and it is making go to market that much more complex. And so you really, again, starts to become an annual rhythm of validating, is that still accurate? Thirdly, we call the revenue engine diagnostic. And so this is the engine, literally. Think of the two pieces as the top two is where you're going and why. And then the revenue engine diagnostic is how you get there. And we'll go into more detail on that in just a minute. And then lastly, critically important here, and couldn't agree more, Gary, on Gary Applegate on the assessment. We need A, F, and S maybe. We believe that a holistic, cross-departmental, end-to-end view of the revenue engine is extremely important. And so we'll talk about a foundation for business intelligence, because everything we do should be rooted in unit economics. We should understand our willingness to invest based on the return on that customer acquisition cost, the lifetime value of the customer, the payback period, how much, because some companies have the luxurious position to be able to front load a lot of capital for growth. And they may be private equity backed or venture backed or whatever the case may be. Others are self-funded. They don't have that luxury. They need cash to pay that back relatively quickly. And so that investment decision is perhaps a little bit different. So Gary, Frey, or Applegate, any comments or perspectives on those 4 pillars from what you've seen work well? Anything missing that you've seen as a component?
G1, you go first, and then I've got a question that's already come in from Peter in Uganda, and that we can address here, or we can even address later on. But G1, go ahead.
To answer your question, I don't see anything missing. It seems circular to me, like it's a never-ending process, right? You're always kind of in some aspect of that process. Obviously, the strategic alignment with the buyer group and buyer group validation is critical. But I have to tell you, I sit up straight when you mention a revenue engine, and the vehicle to execute that revenue engine, and then evaluate and adjust as you go along. I agree with you that the unit economics kind of drive everything, and I'm fascinated about all the work that goes into the customer acquisition, the profiling of the customer, understanding how they buy, why they buy, where they buy, and all of the costs associated with that. So, like I said before, the financial modeling in my mind has started. It hasn't hit the spreadsheet yet, but in my mind,
Watch out. This guy, he can throw a mean pivot table your way. So watch.
So the cost, I guess my question, or my point would be in pillars 1 and 2, because the costs associated with these typically precede revenue. I'd be curious if you would talk just a minute or two about who's in the room, who's doing those things, how long does it take, what, and I know it differs situation to situation. But, and the reason I ask that is because a lot of that stuff happens prior to the CFO really truly getting involved. I mean, you know, we're usually involved from a strategic point of view and starting to understand the buyers and the costs associated with doing business with those buyers. But if you could talk a bit at some point about the timing and possible costs associated with those pillars and who's involved.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's dive into the strategy and market segmentation detail, and then when we get to unit economics, let's discuss that specifically, because perhaps it's the fact that I'm a recovering investment banker, but I have a soft spot in my heart for the CFO having a seat at the table much earlier than is typical. So we can chat about that.
Yeah, I agree. So here's the question to contemplate. And G3, if you want to jump in on this now or later, that's fine. But this is from, again, from Peter in Uganda. And he basically says, hey, you know, it's a volatile environment today. It's being affected by lead approaches that are going back and forth between virtual and in-person engagements, right, with clients. And a lot of that changed. And there's, you know, he's saying that there can be a result in a lack of trust between buyers and sellers. Now that we're having to move more virtually versus in person, what do you think the shelf life is of any strategy that we're pursuing right now? You know, and I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I'd like to get your perspective on that, either G3 or G1. And, you know, what do you think the shelf life of a go-to-market strategy is in this environment?
Yeah, let's actually, when we get to validation of the buyer journey, we'll probably have to go through these relatively quickly in order to get through everything. That's a perfect time to cover that. And we'll make sure we do that.
Love it.
All right, so let's go to the next one, the strategy. The next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what this means. So again, this is not stuff that you probably haven't seen before, but it's a way to approach it. And for the segmentation component of this, it's whom is being targeted, right? It's really, let's go out and revalidate your market. And in many cases, lots of businesses get started because a founder or somebody early in the business experiences a pain point directly, since there's got to be a better way, finds a solution, finds like-minded people, and through the pure will of the founder, they start and create that business, and they find some success. And they generate a brand because of that. They have a brand promise. People trust them. Word of mouth forms, and you start growing and building a business. And then a shock like this happens, and it kind of disrupts everything, and it forces you to rethink about it. And so what I would challenge many people to do, whether you go through this whole process or not, is the amount of data that is available to you today on your market, the businesses that are there, the people that are at those businesses, the sizes of those businesses, is frankly overwhelming, but it's there. And if you haven't done some work around that to look outside of your four walls of your business and look at the makeup of your market and the segments within that market, then I really encourage you to do that, because that's really where it begins. Because again, where you started doesn't mean that that's where it is today, even within your own portfolio. And so that's to your point, Gary, about who's in the room. This is definitely an executive-led effort, right? And so this is where honestly finance can come in. You have some, whether it's product or your execution team or the people that really know the market well. You may bring in a third party to help you. There's MBA interns that can help you with this kind of research. There's lots of ways to go about it. But it really is forcing you to look outward, look from the customer's, the market's perspective, and actually see what that looks like. And you'll hear me say this a lot. One of the challenges or traps that we see companies fall into is that they take a view of the customer, the median customer, which when you do a distribution, you realize doesn't actually exist. There is no median customer. There is a distribution of customers, and you may find that that distribution is very different than what you thought it was. And it could be that your revenue is actually made up of this long tail over here, but all of your efforts are done down here at this part of the chain. And there may be a very good reason for that, but better to know than otherwise. And so that's the most important place to start. And then having a healthy review of, excuse me, problem definition, why they buy. When you ask many people who are running a business why they think their customer buys their product, they will immediately start telling you about their product. When in reality, they're buying your product to solve their problem. And so it is flipping the script to make sure that you are defining the problem from the buyer's perspective. We are huge fans of the jobs to be done framework. You can Google it and find a lot of good research on that. But the most obvious example I provided is, or have heard, is that when people buy a drill, they're not there to buy a drill. They're there because they want a 1/4-inch hole in the wall. The drill just happens to be the most efficient tool at that moment to do it. But there's lots of ways to get a 1/4-inch hole in the wall, and they may be doing that elsewhere today. So you need to be thinking not about that you sell drills, but that you produce results that deliver 1/4-inch holes in the wall. The what they buy, this has changed a lot as well. And when you have been in market for, say, 5 years, and you think you have an idea of who your competitors are, the blind spots come when people are finding ways to solve said problem differently. And it may be a completely different solution set that comes in out of nowhere that actually just changes the definition of the problem that you haven't thought of. Like you're selling hammers and somebody comes in with a completely different vehicle to deliver the solution. So it's really understanding how your product solves that problem, current solutions, and competition. Buyer group and journey, we'll get into that, but that's really the how they buy. And again, from the buyer's perspective, not how you want to sell to them. And then a really important point in this is that you can't do any of this in a vacuum, right? We need to understand the strategic priorities of the company. So for example, well, we are in a generational shift and we want to set our company up for the next generation. And so we've got some goals in the next 3 to 5 years. Great. What are those? Let's work towards those. Or we want to raise capital in the next couple of years. Well, there's some very specific metrics that equity investors are going to want to see. So we need to work towards those metrics. We want to be able to expand a new division, launch a new product. Whatever those priorities are, all of that has to be part of the time set because it's going to affect the timeline in which you do things, and it's going to affect the priorities as well. And then lastly is unit economics. But most importantly, and I would say here, a lot of times companies get fixated on revenue, but a company's real growth comes when you deploy capital efficiently, and you do so at a return that is greater than your cost. And many times it's easy to get lost in the shuffle of generating revenue and you actually have profits, but you're not considering the amount of effort that is required to go into that. And it could be that you have to tie up a lot of capital to get that revenue, even if it's producing a result, which is inhibiting your growth. Are there more efficient ways to do that? Is there a way to shrink the sales cycle? Is there a way to get a faster return? Is there a way to actually decrease the price but accelerate cash? There's, that's what we look at it literally from the building block up. So this is kind of how we would start by tearing apart. And this would definitely start at the executive level to reorient and make sure that we're headed in the right direction. Any thoughts or questions on that, gentlemen?
So, yeah, I've got a thought, and that is, for anybody listening out there, if you think that you know what's in the mind of your customer and you haven't asked them recently, you don't know. And I'll use that a real quick example because I think it applies now as much as any other time. But I was brought in to do sales turnaround for a company that had gone from 52 million to 32 million. The banks had called the notes. The two owners were putting in a couple $1,000,000 a year to keep the doors open because they wanted to keep 250 people employed, but you know, they weren't going to keep writing checks forever. And so it was a challenge. And so when I came in, I asked them, when was the last time that you guys did a voice of the customer survey to where you really understood what the issue was? Because they were hemorrhaging. And they said, and the management team said, oh, well, we know. Well, they didn't, you know, and so we, you know, I love your approach here. I think these 4 pillars are really important. And we will move into digital, but the fundamental things first, regardless of whether it's digital or, you know, not, you know, analog or face-to-face, you know, selling widgets or services, you have to ask, and you have to start with understanding, like, start with segmenting your customer base. What I found was we had 300 and some odd customers, but 4 of them were driving 90% of the revenue, or 5. It was 5. Well, so obviously the voice of somebody that's in the top 5 matters probably more than somebody that's buying, you know, a few $1,000s worth of stuff from you in a year versus somebody that's buying millions of dollars worth of stuff from you. And so just a simple thing that we did, and we actually tiered our surveys so that we could understand, and we had to understand, is this the CEO or somebody in the C-suite that's answering these questions versus somebody that's in accounts payable? Not that one is more important than the other, but the CEO is the one that has the ability to hire and fire you and move to a competitor or not. So I just think, you know, again, this is really important. That was really foundational for us in being able to turn the corner. It wasn't the magic bullet, but we had to start with knowledge. And again, working with hand in hand with the CFO early on. So it wasn't just some marketing or sales thing. It was the entire team from operations through CFO that will make or break that thing. So just my 2 cents on that.
I agree that to your point earlier, Gary S., the velocity of this is just changing so quickly. And you know, this speaks to the question of what's the shelf life of a strategy. And the answer to that is probably decreasing just as rapidly, right? So this is a process, and this is a very, very important process because you know, the forecast, the financial model, the ROI, all of the things that I get excited about kind of are driven off the unit economics. And to the extent that those unit economics are based in fact rather than intuition, is really important to the validity of the financial model. We had a client recently that was pre-COVID. This was a training and development client. They did seminars and workshops, and they did it live. Their customers were large service organizations. Think Big Four public accounting, law firms, that sort of thing. And what they would do is they would go do workshops, and they would do a workshop in Dallas, and you know, Deloitte would send all their folks to Dallas, and that model just wasn't going to work. We knew pre-COVID that we needed to start moving towards a more technology-driven delivery system, right? But when COVID hit in March, I mean, literally in April, their revenue went to 0 because they couldn't ship gears that fast. So, you know, how the customer buys or how the customer wants you to deliver what you deliver to them just fell off a cliff. It just changed overnight. And, you know, fortunately we had started down that path of the strategy, and we just went full bore at it. We knew what it would cost. We just thought we had more time, right? So we adjusted, but the reason that we had to spend that money was to preserve revenue, not to grow revenue. And that's, you know, that's an entirely different conversation. But, you know, we had done what we thought was right getting to know our customer. But we were probably, that client was probably a bit complacent in understanding that the way we were to deliver to that customer would not change that radically, right? So I think the time spent in this area, in this pillar, is vitally important to get to good unit economics upon which to drive a good ROI calculation. So, if you're in this process or if you're entering this process, please do your diligence and include your CFO.
Second that. Okay, let's jump to the next slide, because now we're going to start to touch on Peter's question about validity. So, and I'm actually going to piggyback on Gary Frey's example of the company with 300 customers, and then they discovered they had the 4. And so, without knowing all the details, let's presume that in some ways having 4 great customers is awesome. In some ways, it's really, really risky. And so if you're a company now, you want to de-risk your business, and you tell your team, okay, well, go get more customers, or we want more like the top 4. The reality is your business, probably somewhat on its own without intention, has morphed into a business that is entirely set up to service those top 4 customers. And then there's everybody else that they work with, because they're driving all the volume and the revenue and the relationships and everything else. So you have a false perspective that the rest of the market looks like that. That's the importance of segmentation. And this then comes down to, okay, once you've understood those segments, and there are different sizes of companies, there's different problem definitions and what have you, and you identified using some of the unit economic analysis that, hey, our solution fits really well with these kinds of companies, and we're well positioned to do that, we need to go get more of them. Before you turn a sales team loose to smile and dial, because by the way, nobody's answering the phone anymore, you need to really think through the buyer journey. And that is understanding at particular size companies, how a company buys. Still, individuals are responsible for it, but their roles in the buying process could be different. So you may have multiple people actually involved in the decision. And that's where we kind of break it up, as you'll see us tear it apart as economic buyer, user buyer, technical buyer, and then coach. And one person can play all those roles. Sometimes you have multiple people playing each role, but you really need to tear that apart for your particular customer segment and understand those roles and at what stage they come in. And this is an example that Gartner puts together of, this is a more typical B2B component. And you can see that it is an unobservable maze in terms of what they go through, but they each have problem identification, solution exploration, requirements building, and supplier selection. And the kinds of information that people need within their role at each stage, and the channels and places they go to find that information are different. So, for example, in problem identification, I may know that I have symptoms of a problem, but I haven't really defined the problem yet. And so a company's job in this stage is actually to help me connect my symptoms to the problem that you help solve. And so that's more, I need to find you in ways that I'm not necessarily out searching for a product. But then when I get into solutions exploration, now I've identified that I have a problem, and now I'm actually going to go look for solutions to that problem. It's actually your job to help me do that, because if you don't, I'm going to find other ways, and you've lost control of the narrative. And so but the mediums, the places I go, I might start looking at review sites or whatever is in your industry, a whole host of different things that are going to be different from where I looked in the problem identification. And then I start to narrow it down and look at requirements building. Now I'm starting to pull other people into the buying process, right? I might need a technical perspective. I might need legal. I might need finance. And I need to start to build my business case, or I might need some form of approval or buy-in from my team or another department or whatever the case may be, which in a way opens up a mini process again, because they go back and they ask questions about, well, what about this one? I heard about that one. And then lastly is actually coming down to the selection process. And again, how many times, Gary Frey and Gary Applegate, have you heard about a company that gets down to the 2-yard line and underestimates the complexity of getting that deal signed, and turns it over thinking, oh, we've got a proposal in, we're all good, we're through the contracting phase, but they haven't facilitated that process for them, and in swoops a competitor or some other thing that kills the deal. So it's not done until the ink is dry. But that is a really important part, particularly as you're thinking about new segments, or you've identified new segments that you want to go after. But even in this time of disruption and this fundamental accelerated move to virtual channels, you need to rethink this, because these changes will stick. This isn't okay, well, we're all forced to be doing here on Zoom, and then pick a time period, 9, 12, 2 years from now, 9 months or years from now, we're going to completely snap back to the way everything was before. We know that's not going to happen. And so there are things here that will change even face-to-face communication as we go forward. And so to Gary's point, this getting into this rhythm of validating this, it doesn't necessarily mean you start from scratch every year, but there is definitely a validation, particularly with new segments.
And revalidation of existing customers as well.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. William McKee, who just did an awesome update on our website after months of it's awesome. So go to trustbgw.com. But William McKee and his firm Nomad did an update, and so he's got a question. Would you be willing to take this, Gary? G3?
Yeah, of course.
All right, so here's the question. What roles in the company are responsible for understanding the buyer journey? As a marketing agency, we often work with the inside marketing directors and CMOs. I have a feeling that you see this responsibility to be a function of the leadership team. If so, how do you get the leadership buy-in?
Great question. Great question. So I would actually say that this is definitely something that is typically in marketing's wheelhouse. They are really understanding the customer, but I would say that what needs to happen is we need to have cross-functional involvement in this. At the end, we actually put together a set of resources and frameworks that you can use to help answer these questions. And we, in our work with clients, it will typically start with the marketing team, but we will pull in a product person, a salesperson, a customer success executive, anybody who's the voice of the customer, because what the customer really wants is they want to wade through all of your marketing and sales, some would say noise, and put themselves in the chair of one of your customers and see what that looks like. Get behind the curtain, experience the product, somebody that looks just like them, and say, how does this thing solve my problem? Does it deliver on the desired objective? And does it do it in such a way that fits my business? Is the experience in working with the product and the company what I expect? And it's those two things that deliver on success and actually give you the ability to grow. And that's ultimately what customers are trying to do. So it is the rigor and structure of this process is typically driven by marketing, but the way that you get buy-in is you get inclusion cross-functionally in the department so that you've got multiple views of the customer and their journey.
So before we move off of this slide, if you don't mind, G3, I'd like to make a comment, and that is, having been in 160,000 employee companies and then also been in small companies, I've seen the 160,000 employee companies take this and spend months and months, kind of navel gazing and doing that. But we didn't have that luxury in this 200 plus company that was hemorrhaging. And back to William's question, which I thought was an awesome question, it was all hands on deck leadership team because the pain was so stinking high. And everybody's job was on the line in that situation. And taking this framework, which is really powerful, but it can be overwhelming. Keep it simple, stupid. And actually, Gary has some really good tools that we're sharing. The whole point of this webinar is not to take you through a sales funnel and get you to buy something from us. That's not it at all. Gary Schwake and his team, they've got stuff that they can help you self-implement, or they can actually help you and guide you along the way. But the point is, what we did, not that we were the poster child for doing it right, but because the pain was so high, and I said, let's just do this voice of the customer survey. I used Survey Monkey, coded it so that I knew exactly which tier, and I actually knew even in our top 5 big ones, who was answering what. It was the same thing, but I coded it. I kept anonymity for the sake of, everybody else, but I was the one that could see where this stuff is coming from. And then when we went back to the leadership team and said, oh, by the way, this is what these customers are really saying, their heads exploded because they thought something that was very different. And even what it ended up being was it helped us understand better, like where they were upset with us, which they were frequently upset with us, and also where the opportunities were. And then we also found there was another completely different segment that we hadn't gone after that was available, that we thought, you know what, we really ought to go and pursue that as another option as well. Not like move everything into that basket, but it did become a data-driven decision that was really important. So I'd just say, don't get overwhelmed with this. Use this framework, but keep trying to simplify it. And some data is better than no data, and it's certainly better than assumptions. So,
yes, absolutely. Let's go to the next one, because I think this will further support both Williams and Peter's question, and it gets to this idea of how long is this strategy can be put in place. And so this is what we call the revenue engine, and it is the combination, and the order of this is intentional. The data, the process, the technology, and the people. Now, I am of the belief, like many, that everything happens with people first. However, I would argue that if you bring on great people and you haven't put them into a system that aligns data, process, and technology, you will guarantee frustration and churn. And so if you don't get those right first, and you haven't thought about a repeatable process, then you don't really know who you need, and you'll be hiring the wrong people to do the wrong things, heading you in the wrong direction. So let's break these down. First, and this is probably the biggest, most challenging thing for most companies that have been in business for a long time, is the data and the data layer. And it is everything that's needed to understand the segmentation of your customer. And a lot of times what we see is, and I'd love to get Gary Applegate's and Gary Frey's perspective on this, is that when companies think about customer segmentation, they dive into their books and they segment their customers. But then they never take a look outside of those 4 walls to look at, how does that map to the market that I serve? And it could be very different, and different by design, because you've selected a set, your product fit, you're heavily skewed towards one area or the other. Wonderful. All that's fantastic, as long as you know that you're doing it intentionally. And with that, what we're seeing more and more is that companies are bringing in third-party data into their own systems so that they have some way to map back to a common taxonomy of what a market might look like. And that can be a Dun & Bradstreet number. It can be a whole host of things as you think about, okay, let's say that the economic bureaus across the country have, in fact, we're working with a client right now where they have chosen a segment that works for their particular vertical and industry, but all of the data that they need to really understand where their customers might fit has already been predefined by the various economic agencies. And so they're focused on small to medium-sized businesses. And the way most organizations, most institutions look at that is less than 10 employees, 10 to 100, 100 to 500, and so on. And they've created these artificial other gradations that make it really hard to take their customers and where their team is focused against that data. And then as we look at how companies behave, they behave very differently as breakpoints as well. So starting to think about how you're part of an ecosystem, this data information, you have your own sets of data, but there's a lot of stuff that you can connect to in the market that help you understand that. That's part of this data that we talk about. But it's behaviors, it's attributes, it's a whole source of things that are commonly trapped in various systems that you need to be able to think about. How do I free this up so I can use this? And then how do I make it uniform so that when I say an A customer, everybody knows what that means? Or if I say a customer at this stage, everybody knows what that means. There's no ambiguity at all. Then there's process related to that. And it's, for us, we think about the revenue cycle process, but it can be even into activation, customer success, what have you. And that's clearly defining and mapping it to the buyer journey, the steps that you need to be successful. And really, again, defining that, documenting it, understanding it so that you can measure its performance. Technology is what makes this all work. So a lot of times what we'll find companies do is they will think about a task that they need to solve, and they'll go out and they'll find a tool to solve it versus an outcome that they want to deliver and some of the tools that may be necessary to help them get there. And the vernacular is subtle, but the change is significant in that you want to make sure that you're mapping tools to your business and not your business to tools. And that happens a lot when you, especially in marketing automation, sales automation, CRM and the like, you need to be careful with that. And then lastly, but most importantly, is the people. And this is, once you think about that engine, what are the skill sets? And what I would say is that a lot of times when we're talking to clients about roles to fill, they'll say, I need a marketing person, or I need a salesperson, or I need a operations person, or whatever the case may be, versus they immediately put it into some kind of title and think about a person versus thinking about, well, what is it you want this person to do? Like, what are they responsible for? Who are the people with whom they're predominantly going to interact? What are the skill sets necessary for them to be successful? What are those that they have to come in with, and what are the core skill sets that they need that you can grow with them into, and really breaking that down. And actually, when we do that, we find that it ends up changing whom they think they need to hire quite a bit. Because they, instead of just picking a marketing role, sales role, and going out on LinkedIn and looking for those roles, they're really breaking it down to what they need to be successful at the stage of their business. And then all of this is peppered then with, of course, the investment in the tools has to match the economic value provided by that. How long is it going to take us? And Gary, to your point about using SurveyMonkey, we are huge fans of keep it simple, right? You can very quickly overcomplicate the data and technology stack before you need to, number one. And then secondly, back to the question about the timeline or horizon or shelf life of a strategy, inherent in this is building in the ability to move at speed, to test and learn. And that comes from making sure these are aligned so that you've got an ability, because if you go, you don't have to do it now, but think back to that previous slide where it was an unobservable maze. The reality is that's constantly changing. It's almost like a living, breathing system that's literally adapting every day. And so what the skill set you're really building is the ability to test and iterate quickly, learn, and make adaptations. Sorry, that was a lot.
One of the things that you said that I think is a really critical thing, and people that are marketers on here will understand it, but a minimal viable product, like you don't have to have everything perfect to know that you've got something good, but it has to be validated and it has to be viable. And that test and learn philosophy that Gary talked about is really critical. Direct marketers have been doing that for decades, and they would do an A/B test, and they're always switching stuff out. And so I think you have to have that kind of mentality and nimbleness, especially now, because you could put all the chips on one strategy or execution and miss it.
There's a lot of work to be done there. As you were going through that, I was thinking to myself, okay, that's the most important piece. We really talked about that. Okay, not that most important piece. I think all four of these are equally important in a shifting market that we're in. That really just kind of turns up the heat on the necessity to continue the diligence of this process.
Hey, Gary Applegate, sorry to interrupt. For some reason, your sound is really robotic.
I apologize. Is that better?
No. You sound like from something lost in space. I don't know what this is. Yeah.
Maybe somebody suggested maybe turning off the video, or if you have a headset.
I'll back in later.
Okay.
He can interrupt us at any time when we figure out the sound.
Yeah. Thanks, William.
Yes.
Another one of the challenges of
Speaking of data and technology. Okay, well, let's jump to the last one here. So foundation for business intelligence, and this is definitely where I think Gary Applegate will be of interest as well. This is in many cases we find companies, again, going back to the integrated nature of the importance of a company across the revenue cycle, is a lot of companies will create systems for reporting for their own departments, whether it's the product team, the marketing team, the sales team, what have you. But what we really want to know is the throughput of the system. Like what happens when something comes in the top and we make sure that we get a good expanding customer on the back end. And that takes thinking about the whole system. And this is the purpose of business intelligence. But theoretically, we can capture all kinds of data, but we want to make sure we're capturing the right data. And that's where understanding the key performance indicators is really important. And there is a wealth of information out there on this, but I think we would all agree that a company can't have 15 KPIs to run its business. It may have supporting information and leading indicators and things like that, but realistically, it's probably got 3. And then they waterfall from there. And so it's really understanding those 3 in terms of what's driving the business. And that's what needs to start at the executive level. And then the inputs to that are what the day-to-day management team is actually looking at, because they understand that this variable helps drive this variable. And so that's really important to define. The second is, and this is critically important in a digital first world, is attribution, which is a fancy way of saying, how are you going to measure this? And you, again, we want to consider every digital touch point. If you think like a marketer, and I will admit, one of our theses is that marketing is eating sales, so we tend to think a lot like marketers, is that marketers tag and monitor everything. And so every component of the organization should be thinking the same way. Every digital touch point should have the ability to be measured so that you can see what's happening. And that's the flexible scalable attribution. The data layer is, again, understanding what flows between those systems. The really important piece, and I think for Gary Applegate and I have talked a little bit about this, is really what we call full funnel. And it's the ability, what a company cares about, obviously, is the ability to, in a capital efficient manner, generate revenue, not leads, not cost per click, not opportunities in the pipeline. All of those are leading indicators. But what we really want to understand is, if I spent X dollars on this particular channel, did it help contribute to revenue? And if so, was it the right revenue for the right customer that we want to see? And that's an oversimplistic way to look at it. I agree, because in some cases you may be doing something that looks uneconomic up here, but it has a great deal of influence on other inputs, other channels. A fantastic example is one of my colleagues was a former CMO of an education company, and they were seeing deteriorating performance on a variety of paid social channels, and so they turned off paid social entirely. Well, guess what happened to organic, right? And so what they realized was it's not just one thing, it's part of this whole ecosystem. And there's a big black unobservable portion of the funnel that we can't see. And so you really can't just test a tool or a channel, but you need to think about how they all fit together. So, but again, if you're measuring those things and you're looking at the performance on outcomes, then you can make those decisions intelligently and at speed, because you've aligned on your KPIs and you know what your early indicators of success are relative to your core KPI. And then lastly, a really big one that we believe in and not many companies do well is what we call cohorts. Vintages is another way to think about it. And so in a period of change, it is really important to not just look at all customers in a snapshot, because if I look at sales for June, those sales are comprised of companies who have been with us for 5 years, 4 years, 2 days, 3 years, 6 months, and all of them performed differently and came in for different reasons and different sales functions and different marketing and even different, you may have made changes to customer success or onboarding. So if you start to think about your customers in cohorts, whether it's by size or by time or what have you, you can actually see how they behave over time and start to get early indicators of the changes that you're making. Are you headed in the right direction? Very hard to do that with time in period reporting, much more visible in cohort reporting.
So I got a question for you, G3, and that is, what's the fastest that you've seen somebody kind of take the framework of this, analyze, segment, test and learn, and see results?
Well, I'm going to give you a twisted answer because it actually goes to one of our core themes, back to that test and learn mentality. Is one of the worst things you can do, in my opinion, is take this whole framework, go into the basement for 3 months, do all of this work, and then come back with a, beautiful plan that you're ready to go execute. We think in terms of entrepreneurs, which in a startup world, we like this term minimum viable product, MVP. And that is, you're shipping it probably a little sooner than you really want to. But in doing that, you get the most valuable information. And so the important thing really is that you're never really done with this process, right? It's actually, there is definitely some work that needs to be done up top, but that doesn't mean that you can't start testing and identifying gaps in your technology or in your content or whatever. You have those gaps, and that's okay. And so it really is getting the organization into this concept of, you're never really done going to market, and you're never really done evaluating. You're never really done absorbing information, learning and iterating. And it's more of a process. It is an ongoing rhythm for the business, more so than it is an annual planning cycle process.
Have you seen in that kind of and let's go into today's situation where the world changed like bang. We saw revenues go to zero or greatly reduced from March to April.
Or in some cases went the other way. Right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. But have you seen, do you have any examples of somebody that did a pivot based on some of this framework? Again, not, implementing every piece of it and getting to your point, hey, we're going to spend 3 months in a hole and then we'll come back and figure it out. Because a lot of times, people have not had that ability. We had to move very, very fast, and we're still having to. Can you give any sort of examples of how somebody has actually been able to take some of this, do some test and learn, and start seeing results that made a difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one of our clients is a distributor of commercial products, and they do some light manufacturing as well. And they've had success mostly, well, they both sell to consumers and to commercial customers. And so they have an e-commerce component, which of course turned out to be a good thing and pretty successful from that standpoint. But they also had a sales component that completely changed. And so one of the benefits that they had was they had already been still fairly early, but through the process of looking at the various segments. And so they were able to zero in on, okay, well, which of the customers do we believe are going to be most impacted by this change in we can't show up and knock on their doors anymore. And then it really becomes a set of hypotheses around, okay, well, how do we, first of all, what are they thinking about, right? This has impacted their business as well. And so while we want to sell them some widgets, those widgets may or may not be important to their business anymore. And so I think in many ways, the way that BGW pivoted was, okay, what are the ways that we can be thinking about now? What are our customers dealing with, and how can we add value to them now? And it is being part of the solution, staying in the narrative, and having that customer first mindset that really makes a big difference. But it gets a lot easier when you're in a constant rhythm of understanding your customers and how different ones will behave differently, right? You probably segmented customers and looked at, well, if you're in retail or restaurant, there's one set of impact. If you're digital or services or distribution, it may be a completely different thing that you're thinking about. You may be thinking about, how am I going to keep the wheels on because business has gone off the roof? And in other cases, you're thinking the other way.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm going to try my audio again. Is that better?
Oh yeah.
Much better.
Okay. So what I was saying on the previous slide was, as you were going through the revenue engine components, I found myself saying, well, that one's the most important. And then you would talk about the next one. I say, well, now that one's the most important. It turns out that they're all equally important. And as you continue to evaluate not only new opportunities in the market and new customers in the market, but reevaluating, existing opportunities, getting back to, the title of this program is, how do you do that in shifting markets? Well, the markets are shifting at a speed that we haven't seen in a long time, if ever. So the validity of the process, or the velocity of the process, needs to move in a similar fashion. So you need to be doing this more and more in order to get valid information to be doing your forecasts and your budgets and deciding how to return, maximize your return on the capital spent. We find ourselves now in stepping into November, and a lot of clients think November and December is time to do budgets for next year. And what we're seeing and what we're encouraging is more of a rolling forecast mentality or methodology. It's important to have annual targets, certainly, but by the time we hit June of next year, I don't think it's fair to ask a sales team what they think they're going to be able to sell next year, because things are just changing so fast. So this process of staying in touch with your customers, understanding how they buy, what they buy, why they buy, and the foundation for business intelligence, building your KPIs and having the constant feedback and the constant data loop is extremely important to just putting together a rolling 6 or 9 month forecast.
Right.
So I think what's valuable about the process, given the markets that we're in, is that it is a framework, and it fights complacency, right? So a lot of folks say, okay, I've got that customer. We can guarantee that customer is sustainable for a couple of years. That might not be the case anymore. we have clients that are evolving from a technology adaptation or technology investment point of view quicker than they ever thought they would. We have one manufacturing client they're working with, and their mantra is, we need to be a technology company that, oh, by the way, does manufacturing, right? So the way they order and the way they want products released to them is changing tremendously. And that impacts my client's business, because now the way they service that customer is, there's a lot more work involved. It's not just a PO and ship. It's a PO and, ship in quantities they want, when they want, where they want, to the location they want. And that's nothing new. But I think with the development of the micro logistics in the country, as a result of Amazon and click and ship, the expectation is, just in time has just gone through the roof, right? We don't want a shipment a week. We want a shipment a day. So it's important to, I appreciate the framework. It's important to have a framework to be, to be doing this with, to get good information upon which to rely in your forecast.
Yeah, a couple of points there, Gary. You bring up some really good ones. One is, you mentioned the manufacturer and how the way in which the customer now wants to either receive information around the widget itself, right? We talk frequently about product with a capital P, and that means the entire experience that customer has with you is your product. It's not just the widget you ship out the door. It's what is the interaction like when they order with you? If you're still using PDFs and sending them an email and making them print them and fill out a pricing sheet and send it back to you in some way, shape, or form, those days are numbered. Like you will have, if you don't already have competitors who have thought about integrating into PO systems or making it really, really easy for them to reorder or buy, or even anticipating the need to reorder and making that decision for them. Invoicing, payments, servicing, all of those things. That's the concept of software's eating the world. Is everything that we do is being either replaced by or augmented by some software interface, and that is your product. And so it's that holistic view. Again, that's why if you take the perspective of what is the problem the buyer is trying to solve as they define it, and how do they seek to solve it, it'll really help you understand where you fit in that ecosystem, where your blind spots might be, and how you can fill that. The other, back to your point about confidence in the projection model, that goes up exponentially for everybody involved when it's done on the basis of a bottoms up build up. There's always going to be a top down component to it because you want to stretch people and expand into the white space. But at the same time, you want to know then what has to happen to make that doable. And you understand your risk points to say, well, the reason we say we're confident in that revenue number is that we're made up of this number of mid-sized customers who purchase on average this much amount, who take this long to close, and we have this many in the pipeline. And you've done that analysis to know what's a stretch for the team and what has to go right, and then what you need to work on to get there.
I agree with all of that. The other question that I have for you is in the buyer journey, understanding the buyer's journey, is there an element of understanding where they are going, not only meeting them where they are today, but where they intend to be tomorrow? For instance, if you understand that your customer is implementing SAP and the way they order is going to be different 6 months from now than it is now, and you can hopefully get into a conversation with them about what that means based on what we know about SAP. We have other customers that order, that we receive orders through SAP, and this is how it works with them. Is that going to be similar with you? I mean, is there some anticipatory due diligence built into that process with your customers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gary. And it brings to mind a couple of things. One is as we think about, so for prospective customers, as we think about the selection solutions phase, if your solution is part of a larger ecosystem, then you need to proactively think about that. A great example is we're working with a client right now that is in the primary care space. And the reality is that you can't, as an individual or as a company, you can't solve your healthcare problem with only one widget, in this case, primary care. And so if you haven't thought about how the various ways in which your product fits inside of that holistic solution ecosystem, doesn't mean you need to provide everything, but you need to make it really easy to understand how it fits and how to integrate those things. That's critically important. The other piece is that companies that have relationships with customers but have an upsell opportunity, we tend to think of the buyer journey as something that's for new customers. But the reality is it can be applied to existing customers as well, as we're looking for where are ways that we can think about proactively understanding our customer base. And we're huge fans of kind of account management plans, which is if you have people who are assigned to your accounts, they should know and have a plan around what's changing, and the organization then sees that enough that they're proactively reaching in and saying, okay, well, if they're making that change to SAP, here is how all the different ways that their relationship with us is going to change. And in order to preserve and hopefully grow that relationship, here's what we're going to do to help them. And that becomes a natural, you're helping them solve a problem, and they're pulling your product through versus you pushing it.
So another quick observation, and this is along the line of keep it simple, stupid, for Gary's like me from Kansas that need to keep it simple. A fundamental truth is that the more honest and frequent and meaningful conversations you can have with your key constituents internally as well as externally is critical, because we're bombarded with customer satisfaction surveys and all that kind of stuff, but all you got to do is roll into your favorite automotive repair place, especially if it's a dealership that you bought your car or your vehicle, and you're going to get baited surveys that, hey, if you don't give me a 5, I'm going to lose a whatever. I mean, it's a baited survey that means nothing, and it actually creates cynics in the client base. I'm not advocating that at all. I'm advocating the antithesis, but actually having conversations, whether it be picking up the phone or whether it be doing something simple like a Survey Monkey that's not just, give me a metric that I want to hear, but you're actually giving them the ability to have feedback. That's where there's a lot of power. And this is where business intelligence comes from, because it's based on a real conversation. And I think, let's just keep it simple and let's not lose sight of that, because those are the areas. And I've seen a company recently do a massive pivot, and this kind of goes to G1's thought, Gary Applegate, which was the mindset of, am I really a manufacturer or am I a technology company or whatever? I've seen that shift happen in a couple manufacturing or even staffing companies that realized after listening to their client base that what they were really delivering wasn't a widget or a service. They were delivering a differentiated way that happened to be through technology in those cases. And in our case, we had to pivot very fast in the middle of tax busy season. And we're like, we're not having the conversation, hey, are you happy with your current CPA firm? We just decided, hey, we're all in the same boat. We've got to survive. And we had some clients that were doing great and some that were just devastated by this whole thing. And how do we help them? And by, we're really a business growth company that happens to have expertise in tax and audit and bookkeeping. So I just think that it's important as we do some introspection about what are we really doing, but get outside of our own mind and ask the questions to our outside customers, because they're the ones that are framing you, whether you know it or not.
Yep.
We've got 5 minutes left, and I just want to remind everybody, we will, if you came on late into this broadcast, we will put this up on the BGW CPA YouTube channel, where we've got tons of all of our other webinars up, and that will be probably give us about 3 hours after this concludes, and then I'll have that to where Gary Schwake as well as Gary Applegate, they can see that as well. But just a reminder of that. If you do have questions, thanks to people in Uganda and also in Charlotte, North Carolina, sending us some questions. But use that Q&A function, and then if afterwards you still have other things that you want to ask the folks, you can go ahead and email me at gfrey, F-R-E-Y, at trustbgw.com, and I can direct those to Gary Schwake, or Gary, you can also give your email address later on if you want to do that too, and that's probably appropriate. But if you do have questions, hit us up on the Q&A.
Yeah, and if you want to go to the last slide there, Gary, one of the things that I know will be on the BGW website as well. But as Gary Frey mentioned earlier, we have a ton of go-to-market, what we call go-to-market resources on our site, all of which are free. And so the growth audit guide, much of what we talk about here, it's literally going through each one of those sections and providing some questions for you to review with your teams. Collectively and individually, we find both is a good way to do it. It comes with a link to a worksheet that allows you to actually fill out those questions if you want to do it there. We talked about this buyer journey concept and a matrix there that aligns a specific buyer to the stage and how they're defining the problem and what you should be thinking about. And then we mentioned cohort reporting. There's a report and an article there. And then you can find all of those on yieldgroup.co, go to market resources, or just go to the website and you'll see those in the growth resources in the corner. And then my email is gary@yieldgroup.co. Not .com, but .co. And feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to help. But I think you'll find that the resources are a great thing that you can take back with your team and apply those.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll do is, because I know we had some folks that registered that couldn't make it for one reason or the next, and I think what I'll do is I'll ask Rachel to see if we can go back and send to everybody who registered some of these links so that they can see, they can view the webinar as well as have access to those resources, Gary.
Yep.
All right, so I've got another, let's see what we've got here. Somebody's hitting us up on the chat. Oh, hey, thanks, William. It's good to have you. And thanks for doing a great job on our website. Any other questions from the gallery for the G3 band?
New album out next month.
I'll jump in and say it was really good hearing Gary Schwake play lead guitar on this gig. I feel like I played bass and maybe G2 was on the drums or something. Maybe we can switch it up next time and each play a different role.
That'd be great. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I am a drummer, and you know what they call somebody who hangs around musicians? A drummer. So, yeah. But all right. Any other questions out there from the audience, or chats if you want to harangue us? But Gary Schwake, thank you so much for kind of really pulling this thing together. G1, Gary Applegate, it's always good to have you. And I love your perspective, because what you show is having a really smart CFO at the table early on is really critical. That's been really critical for any time I've seen success in doing a turnaround or just growing a company. Without that you know, if you just have somebody, your CFO or your financial people in a hole cranking out numbers, you're missing a huge part of the charger for your engine.
Totally agree.
So, and
Yeah,
that's,
we find a lot of instances where the CFO doesn't have a front seat in the bus, and they spend a lot of time. The business spends a lot of time circling back and getting the financial function up to speed if that ever happens. So you're exactly right. To the extent that you can include the CFO and maybe even the controller up front in a process like this, the better off you are.
Yep, totally agree.
one thing about it in a time like this where, you know, everything is challenged, if you will. The more you can bring that team together and unite around the cause of either, you know, hitting the gap, you know, to accelerate and take advantage of an opportunity, or just, you know, hey, let's batten down the hatches and we got to get everybody rowing together to survive. It's an amazing thing that can happen to your team and your cohesiveness if you do that and you bring them together and are as transparent as possible. So, you know, we're at the 10:31 hour. So I just want to say thank you again to Gary Schwake, Gary Applegate, the original member of the G3 band, G1. And again, we will have this thing up on the BGW CPA YouTube channel later on this afternoon. Gary Schwake will have it up there as well. And I don't know if Gary Applegate or not, but nonetheless, we'll have this up. And hopefully this won't be the first time that you'll see the G3 band, and we'll do something else together again.
We need an encore for sure.
All right, guys, everybody, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for including
Y'all
me.
have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.